Everybody, those who are tuning in live and those who are watching afterwards. I am Jacob Daniel, host of the Daniel 3 Biblical Anarchy podcast. Tonight, I'm excited to have Angela McArdle on. Angela, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. So, for those who are watching who are fellow members of the Libertarian Party and the Mises Caucus, you probably don't need too much of an introduction, but I feel like a lot of my audience might not be that familiar with you because not everyone who watches my show is heavily involved in the LP. So, I wanted to start out with a little bit of just, getting to know you a bit more and your background and how you came to be doing the things you're doing today. So, maybe start out with like where you come from and just a little bit about your upbringing and what led you, especially also like from a Christian perspective, to look into libertarianism and what was that journey like? How did it come about?
So I grew up in the church. My dad's a minister, technically a Southern Baptist minister. I really don't think that that's so critical as to how he was ordained. He pastored a Christian and Missionary Alliance church for a long time, which we refer to as CMA. And I had kind of an interesting experience growing up. I grew up in East Texas. My dad's a pastor, but going to a CMA church, we learned a lot about government in other countries, just kind of accidentally, because we had missionaries coming in all the time. And like a big thing in missions, as most of you would know who are Christians and really involved in the church, is that there's a lot of countries where you're not supposed to do that. A lot of communist countries and other places where you don't send people to talk about the Bible or anything. It's not just Christianity. There's a lot of things you're not supposed to talk about. So I, as like a 7-8-year-old, was very like steeped in defiance to government, because we would hear twice a year from missionaries, and we had people in our home all the time about how they were getting their heads lopped off by warlords and locked in cages in China and Vietnam, and just all kinds of horror stories. So it had a really profound impact on me as a child, and I have always been really distrustful of government because of all of the stories that I've heard about oppression of Christians and missionaries in other countries.
Yeah, fellow pastor's child here too, and my dad actually was a missionary on top of that, so I know exactly what you're talking about. The story my dad likes to talk about the most, because he's not full libertarian, but very libertarian leaning. I think partly because of his experiences, kind of like what you're describing. One time they went to just go bring food and like clothing and supplies and stuff to a country in Africa. I forget exactly which one, but they were literally turned away because they were the government, like the port authorities, were like, you have to pay a bribe basically to be able to dock with their stuff, and the bribe was so expensive that it was cheaper for them to literally dump everything they had than to pay the bribe to bring the stuff in. So, like, just like, you hear stories like that about how a lot of the poorest places in the world are poor because of their governments, because of how oppressive they are. And then, of course, you find out that American politics and foreign policy has a lot to play into that as well, because a lot of the times we're the ones propping up these regimes in one degree or another. So, yeah, I can definitely relate to that as far as the upbringing and whatnot. I think I remember from watching you in podcasts in the past say that like I remember I heard you describe it before, how you became a libertarian and then an anarchist. What was like your, like, I know when I became a libertarian and an anarchist, I then had to go back and try to reconcile it to my faith, because I was just like, I took the red pill and then I was like, okay, but I've always been taught these certain things about the Bible, about Romans 13, all that stuff. And I was like, is there a way to make sense of this? What was that process like for you as far as like, reconciling your faith to the political view that you came to?
Well, I think my biggest like red pill moment as a Christian was probably when I was 12 and I heard about my dad's friend who escaped Pol Pot's killing fields. She got hit in the back of the head with an axe and thrown in a mass grave, with a bunch of other dead bodies. And she crawled out and ran, with a major head trauma, and was shot and still made it across the border. And that
Wow.
really put into perspective for me what we're supposed to honor the most. Is it God's law or is it man's
Mm.
law?
Yeah.
That it's just, I was like 12 years old sitting in a seminar watching this video and this reenactment, and then she like walks out. My dad's like, oh, meet, Inta and Simone and Ali. They survived killing fields. It's just like really mind-blowing. That really had me questioning everything. Actually, I think before that, my first like really hardcore thing was I was in elementary school during Desert Storm, and we were supposed to have this like moment of silence and then say the Pledge of Allegiance while everything was popping off in the Middle East. And I went home, and it was just too serious and weird. And I understood we were at war. I went home and I asked my parents about the Pledge of Allegiance, and they were like, oh, it's good. And I was like, but isn't it like praying to the flag? And my
Yeah.
dad was like, oh, crap. Like, what have I done? And I was like, I don't think I'm supposed to do it because you told me not to like swear on the Bible or to swear to God. And I'm not supposed to take the Lord's name in vain. I can't do this. And like I had like this big argument as a seven-year-old during Desert Storm. So
Yeah, what's funny is like it's sad that more Christians aren't known for this. The first time I encountered someone in school that didn't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance or like the national anthem was it was a girl in my grade who was an atheist. Her parents were atheists, and they had objections to her doing the pledge because of the whole line like under God and all that.
mhm.
But the way that like the rest of the class turned on her and like ostracized her socially because like, oh, you're weird, you don't do our creepy pledge to skycloth ritual, so you're not one of us. Like the just from a young age, how she was ostracized because of that is, it's something that still sticks out in my mind today. And it's sad that Christians aren't known for that because like that to me, like that fits in with what the Bible talks about, right? Like we're supposed to be like sojourners in this world. Like this isn't our true home. So if anyone should be sticking out in a crowd, you would think that Christians should be, not not the people who are literally like saying I am of this world and nothing else. But unfortunately, there's in America at least just a lot of heavy entanglement of Christian theology with this kind of like it's like this weird Western branding of Christianity that's very Americanized. That
Yep.
that when you go back and actually read the Bible and try to like interpret it through an actual like proper hermeneutic that relates to like the time it was written, doesn't really make sense at all.
Yeah. I completely agree. Like, like the Romans 13 thing, it gets thrown in my face, more than maybe any other verse.
Oh my
Well,
God. Like, I don't know if
besides,
have you seen the new, Michael Mouse is on a podcast with Michael Knowles of the Daily Wire.
yeah.
And literally like, as soon as because like they're talking about Malice's book and he had Tolstoy in there. And then so the minute religion gets brought up, Michael knows, yeah, but what about Romans 13? And I literally had like a full body eye roll in the middle of work as I'm listening to this because I'm just like, oh God, like why? Why does everyone just like, like reflexively go to this pass? And I get why, but it's just when you've answered it so many times, it just gets annoying. But what
Yeah.
are your
And
thoughts on that passage? Because that's like the number one passage that gets cited. I have my own way of handling it, but I was interested to hear kind of like what your answer to that is.
so there's also, there's Mark 12 through like,
Sure.
or 13 through like 16 or 17 too about taxes. And is that like, are we talking about, give to Caesar? Are we talking about morality or lawfulness? That's usually how I approach that. But with Romans 13, I think there's two major things that I point to. And one is this just like kind of like an obnoxious technical argument about translation. Not every theologian agrees that it was proper, that we are interpreting it properly, or that we even agree on the translation. But that really goes out the door when we're just talking with the average layperson, which brings up an important consideration. And I think this is something that we don't talk about enough. And we definitely talk about it in libertarian circles. And there's an analogy is, how much are people expected to know about early church history and the historical context before we like allow them to start talking about the Bible? There's not a lot of education on this topic even within Christian circles. And I think that's why the evangelical community goes so hardcore with this, and why they try to cram the pledge down our throats, even at church services. But aside from that, I think that, well, Paul was a Roman citizen, and he had a very different background than a lot of other apostles. And historically, like, going into Romans, like, he hadn't been really in that church community before. And there was a lot of fighting going on, which is another really interesting analogy for libertarians, anarchists. Well, anarchists, you guys have infighting too. We all fight. Anybody who hates the government doesn't get along.
There's definitely a lot of parallels, though, between Christianity and libertarianism.
Yeah. And and there are parallels between what was happening then culturally and what's happening right now. And I don't just mean like the fall of Rome. I mean like absolute like the cult of emperor worship and state worship. Yeah. And I think that there were a lot of things that Paul was addressing regarding this cult of Caesar worship, with the nationalism and the pushback against nationalism and the division it was causing within the church between Jewish people and Roman citizens. And if we were to understand things within that context, it would start to make a lot more sense. I also think that it was pastoral and community based, not necessarily Paul preaching about how people should behave with regard to government for the next 3 millennia.
Yeah, and I mean, I always find it silly that people say Romans 13 means to just, blindly follow the state, when I'm like, Paul wrote half the New Testament like in jail, and right. The apostles died at the hand of the states because they refused to, like, so, I think that the simplest answer is that, like, he uses the word submit there, and my friend Craig Hargis on the Bad Roman Project, who I have a lot of other disagreements with, but he likes to bring up the analogy of like Rosa Parks, how like she disobeyed the law, but she did submit to the punishment rather than like violently resist. And I think it's kind of like how we respond to the government is kind of in the same vein of like when Jesus says, "Don't return evil for evil, turn the other cheek," etc. Now, I'm not a pacifist, but I do think that we should be trying to mimic Christ as much as we can, and Christ didn't really like use violent means as a way to resist evil. You know what I mean? So I think as Christians, we should always be trying to find the most peaceful means we have available to us, and sometimes, I think very often, actually, non-violent resistance, non-forceful resistance is often the best path that we can have toward resisting evil. It doesn't always like work in the short term, but over the long term, it tends to be, I think, what generally works out in most instances. And I think when you look at Romans 13 and in that sort of light, it also makes a bit more sense. Although the translation stuff you bring up is also important too. And I think a lot of people don't realize how difficult it is to translate Greek to, English, let alone Greek to anything else, without having all the cultural context and all that. It's, just the word, like because the subject of Romans 13, the word used is exousia, and exousia is used a bunch of times in the New Testament, and it has different meanings depending on the context. What I like to bring up is that the passages where exousia clearly means nations and states, it's usually being the exousia in those passages are referred to as like demonic powers. So it's like, right. if you want to define exousia as state, okay, well, they're demonic. And it isn't like when Jesus was in the desert and Satan said, "If you bow to me, all the kingdoms of the world which are mine to give will be yours." So to me, it's just, no matter which way you want to slice it, I like to go the direction of just saying governance doesn't require a state, right? Like, I believe in the idea of law and rules. Like, I'm an anarchist, but I'm not a no rules anarchist. I'm a no masters, no rulers anarchist. So you can have law, you can have governance. You just don't need this monopolistic entity called the state to do so, especially when the state kind of violates the purview of Romans 13, because Romans 13 says that the governing authorities are not a terror to good works. It's like, well, the state is pretty much the opposite of that. So right. It's like, no matter which way you go about it, I think you just run into a really hard wall trying to use Romans 13 to justify any kind of statism.
And I think that most people read Romans 13 in a vacuum without taking it into the
Yeah.
context of all of the rest of Romans.
Yep.
I like to point to Romans 2. Like Apostle Paul is saying that people who are self-serving and don't obey the truth are going to be given over to like wrath and indignation and things like that. And it talks about the law and how people who obey the law will be justified, but he's not talking about man's law. They're talking about God's law. So then that comes first in the letter too.
Yeah, and the word exousia, actually, the most cited use of the word exousia is to define like God's law and God's authority and like the like God's moral law. So yeah, I think that's all very good. And there's other passages other than Romans 13, but I think they all kind of say about the same thing. Which is like to submit to them. But there is one passage where he says submit and obey, which I haven't looked into much yet, but I got a feeling that's also probably a translation thing. I mean, there's just so many words in the Greek, like, and even in the Hebrew, like I know, like in Hebrew, like for example, like they don't have a separate word for slave or for servant, which that causes a lot of confusion.
Right.
It's just we have to. And I'm not a biblical scholar. Like I haven't gone to school for this. I do my best being a amateur internet Googler to try to, inform myself of this stuff. But I think that's better than just blindly listening to what people say when it seems to be in open conflict with so many stories in the Bible, right? I mean, Moses didn't submit to the governing authorities. Daniel 3, but I named my podcast after, Meshach, Radshach, and Abednego certainly didn't submit to the governing authorities. The apostles didn't submit. There's just countless examples, I think. And I like the way you put it too, which is like, we have to be, we have to submit to God first. And anytime, at the very least, anytime submitting to God comes in conflict with submitting to the state, we have a clear answer of which way that conflict is supposed to go.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another thing that Romans 2 says all the time is, or in at least one circumstance, it says that if like an uncircumcised man keeps the law, will his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? And it's like Paul is analogizing, the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law.
Right.
And talking about what's in your heart. And, like based on that, I'd say like, what is he saying? What's more important, keeping the letter of the law or the spirit of the law? I'm always going to go with the spirit of the law.
Absolutely. Wasn't that what the Sermon on the Mount was all about? Like Jesus saying, like, listen, like, and people often say Jesus was contradicting the Old Testament. Like, no, I think he was showing, here's the consistency of it. Here's passages you guys are ignoring, but also the law was never intended to be used as a here's how evil I can be. Right. It was just a limit on human evil, but you should strive to be as good as you can be, and you should understand the spirit and the intent behind the law, and not just use it as an excuse to just be as, I'm going to go right up to the line because that's what God allows me to do. Like if you do that, you miss the entire point. And that's what Jesus said about the Pharisees too, was that like you wear the law on your robes and all this, but you don't have the law in your heart. And I think it's always, infinitely more important to try to write the law in our hearts and to model what Jesus did than it is to, pedantically, go through the Bible and find all the passages that you can use to try to rule. It's kind of like people use these passages to try to force you into their worldview. And Jesus said, and it was one passage in Mark, I forget, where he talks about the Gentiles, how they seek to rule and lord over one another. And he says, that shall not be the way it is among you. And the word he used there was archos, which he was saying like the Gentiles try to be archists to each other. So, that's a pretty, I like using that passage. I forget the exact, it's Mark something. I think it's Mark 9 or Mark 11, but it's a pretty like, hey, Jesus says, don't be an archist. So that leaves you with one other option. So yeah, I mean, I think we've covered that pretty well. One criticism that I hear a lot from other Christian libertarians and anarchists, and then this will lead into, I think we wanted to also talk about the post-libertarians, I get this a lot. Like I brought up my friend Craig Hargis, who is a fellow Christian anarchist podcaster, but he takes the stance that a lot of Christian anarchists do, and I've been back and forth on this topic, that if you're an anarchist, especially a Christian anarchist, you shouldn't be engaged in politics because, various reasons. It's inconsistent. Jesus didn't engage in politics. It muddies the message, etc. What is your reasoning for why you think that you can be a Christian, you can be a Christian and an anarchist, and then also maybe like why you think it's not in conflict, why you personally feel driven to work within the political realm, even while saying politics is basically something that we're trying to, I guess, get rid of in a sense. So maybe touch on that for a little bit.
We live in a time where it's nearly impossible to disentangle yourself from political action. Everything that we do is politicized. Entertainment is politicized. Diet is politicized. You can't purchase something without your tax dollars going towards something that you don't approve of. Even if you try to be a strict agorist, like you got to put gas in your car, you got to buy groceries. You can try to dodge taxes as much as you can, and it's just inescapable. You got to drive on government roads, and I think that it is reasonable to take a defensive posture with political action to try to stave off as much immoral tyranny as you can. So to me, politics are self-defense. And so I'm not interested in lording my political opinions and behaviors over other people to coerce them. I'm just trying to get out from under it so that I can live my life. And that's pretty much my position.
Yeah. And I know like a lot of Christian anarchists tend to be pacifists, which I think that's part of the divide that we have. Like, I don't consider myself a pacifist. I think self-defense is acceptable. I don't think it's always the right move, because I do think modeling the turn the other cheek thing is useful in certain situations. I think that's less about like when someone's actually committing violence against you, and more like for matters of like like a slap, like to use the metaphor, a slap in the cheek isn't going to kill you. So, I mean, if somebody's harming you, but it's in a way that you'll live and it's not going to severely impact the rest of your life, or even more so, like it's one thing to turn the other cheek for yourself, but then what if they're going after your neighbors and your family? Because the problem I have with pacifism isn't even so much like I don't really need to defend myself, except maybe like I don't want to die because I want to be able to be there for my wife and my kids. But I'm more compelled actually to resist pacifism because I love my neighbor. Now I know Jesus says to love your enemy too, but like, okay, if loving my neighbor and loving my enemy come in conflict, I think I have to choose the side of the one who isn't initiating aggression. I think that makes sense. What do you think?
Yeah, we're also called to provide for our families and defend our families. Aside from Abraham's sacrifice, which God didn't end up having Abraham actually kill Isaac. I'm trying to think of a time in biblical history where God says, let the state murder your kids.
Right.
And I can't think of one. And we're not there yet are we? Christians would disagree on that. I was going to say we're not there yet, but actually we do see a lot of state campaigns for abortion. And now we're seeing what a lot of people believe is abuse in public schools with mask mandates for small children and a lot of other things that,
you could almost construe abortion, especially in the Black community, as a genocide waged by the state. I mean, it's not that far of a stretch.
Right. And even if you're pro-choice because I don't know if government should handle it, because that's generally I guess that's the position that I take, where I'm like, I would never do that. And I would tell people not to do that. But I'm not sure if technically we should make a law about it, because this is very complex. Even from that position, when you see government really pushing it, and when you see certain politicians talking about how even partial birth abortion should be legalized, that's pretty gross.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I definitely I definitely agree with you. Like on the topic of abortion, I'm very pro-life in a moral sense, but
Hmm.
I just don't trust the state to not make it worse. You know what I mean? And like I feel
Yep.
like the only way the state can, like, the market could ban abortion, like it's a bad way to put it, but the market in an anarchist society, I think, could have torts and contracts and set up to make abortion effectively banned. And I would trust that. I don't trust the state to do it because it's going to end up in an invasion of rights that's greater than what you're trying to save. I think, like, every miscarriage would be open to government investigation. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
you
and
could
there.
lock pregnant women in prisons and doctors in prisons. I just, like, I don't know. That seems like way too, you know, edging on, giving the government that much power to invade people's privacies and invade their rights. I'm just not comfortable with it.
Right. And there have been a few horror stories, and I recognize, that these are small stories and they get disproportionate media attention. But there have been a few stories about women getting investigated, and having the cops knock on their door in more conservative states when they had
Yeah.
a late term miscarriage. And that's got to be really devastating for a woman to go through. And then people are treating you like a murderer. Not a
Yeah.
good thing.
Yep. Absolutely agree on that. Um, yeah. I always, I definitely don't think political action is the only means to
Hmm.
fight for liberty. And so when Christian anarchists are like, well, don't put your faith in politics, it's like, well, I don't. It's just a tool. Like,
Yeah.
and to me, it's like, I want to utilize the best tools for the job. I think politics is well suited for certain jobs. There's also some other jobs that it's not well suited for, and maybe agorism is a better choice, or maybe just preaching it in your, teaching your kids, raising your kids with the right values is an important part of it. You can't centrally plan getting to a freer society, let alone an actually freed society, because it's like we don't live in Ancapistan right now, like, as much as we want to. So
Right.
I can either say all or nothing and continue to let my neighbors and family be oppressed, or I can try to do something. And even though politics is violent, politics is a lot less violent than actually, like, hey, let's round up, let's go do the big igloo option. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
that's so. I mean,
absolutely.
there is a point of government tyranny where I probably would advocate for that, but we're not there yet. And I want to, war is ugly. Like, as a libertarian, like, I'm very anti-war. War is deadly, even if you're fighting a quote unquote just war, and I guess technically that can exist, but it's still devastating. Innocent people are still going to die. So I would rather not have war as a solution if there is any other solution or means available on the table. I also hold out for the possibility that anarchism might be, like anarchism on any level, on any societal level, no matter how big or small, might be something we can't achieve. So I don't want to, like, I call this the nirvana fallacy. It's like, I don't want to just, like, if I can't have the world exactly the way I want it, then I'm just going to retreat from society. Now, we don't want to merge with society, but I think, what Jesus taught was to be in the world, not of it, but to be in it. We don't want to just retreat out of society and just isolate ourselves from the world. We're supposed to be light and salt onto the world. So that
Yes.
means we can't completely separate from it. And I think this is kind of a good segue to uh, the other subject we wanted to talk about, which is
Hmm.
the post-libertarians and all them, because that's sort of the message, one of the messages I think that they are pushing is sort of this, like, weird Christian retreatism, where it's just like, society has failed, and what we need to do is just, like, well, first you get rich, and then you go find some unoccupied area, and you go build your
Hmm.
little, like, Christian commune paradise or something, and just leave society behind and go rebuild some kind of, Christian liberty or Christian monarchist, you know utopia somewhere else. Is I mean, I'm being a little bit, flippant in my description of their arguments, but that's how it comes across to me. You did have that debate on Lions of Liberty, which hasn't aired yet, so we can't talk too much about it. But you had that debate with Matt Erickson. Talk a little bit about, for those who, they haven't seen the debate yet, but what your general thoughts are on, like, the post libertarian movement, and as it relates to the subjects we're talking about.
Well, let's deconstruct it a little bit because it's sort of
Sure.
a very mixed up, inherently contradictory argument. There's
Sure.
a lot of arguing for agorism and removing yourself from civilization, I guess, as much as you can, like society. But then there's also this element of trying to get power, political power, social power, wealth, influence, and you have to try to kind of parse it and figure out what they're really talking about. So, I mean, we've talked a little bit about, like the pitfalls of agorism. We're supposed to be the salt and light of the earth. And I think that with libertarianism, I think there's a lot of analogies with Christianity, and that's something they don't agree with me on. But I really think that they're there. And I think that our duty, we're obligated to go out and like spread the message of liberty. And that's how you wake people up. I think that's really important. But agorism doesn't protect you from getting ruby ridged or wacoed. Unfortunately, it doesn't. You
Nope.
really get that eye of Sauron on you, actually, once you completely pull out of society. And so I don't know what the answer to that is. Some people say that it's martyrdom. I think that it's not the place of people who are new Christians or people who are experimenting with Christianity to call on other people to be a martyr. I just don't. That's not a mature Christian position. Or at least I'd say that's definitely not a position for Christians who are immature in their faith to be taking.
Yeah, I don't think martyrism is something that you should seek out. You should be, I wouldn't say willing. You should recognize it's a possibility.
Yeah.
Like there is a point where obeying and following Christ might lead you into those things, and that happens. I mean, that even happens today in some of the most totalitarian parts of the world, where following Christ can literally get you killed. So, yeah, you have to recognize that as a possibility, but you shouldn't flippantly or like childishly almost like seek it out or be like, oh well, the apostles died in the name of Christ, so like that should be what I'm aiming to do too. It's like,
Right.
I don't know. I mean, that's if God has that as a plan for you, I think it's going to happen. You don't have to seek it out. But if God doesn't have that as a plan for you, I don't think that's the majority. I don't think God has that as a plan for the majority of Christians. I think that actually God often rescues and preserves his children to keep them safe, even in the most hostile of circumstances. Actually, it's kind of funny. Christianity seems to be a weird religion that thrives under persecution.
Yeah.
Which, it's almost like Christianity has started to decline in the West because that persecution widely went away, and then people got complacent, and also there's a little bit of entanglement with the ruling and political mechanisms of society there as well. But that's a bit of a tangent. But yeah, it's just, there's something about it, and I like how you said it's kind of a self-contradictory, and it's like a weird amalgamation of a bunch of different things. And I've invited Matt on my podcast, and if he still wants to come on, I'd love to talk to him. But it seems really hard to nail these things down, because it's like it's almost like you're playing a game of what is it, whack-a-mole, and you just literally it's like and then it's like an endlessly moving the goalposts from one subject to the other. But I
It's
don't see how
incoherent.
I love agorism. Agorism is great for have a garden, do cryptocurrency, engage in the black and gray market. I'm all for that. But agorism isn't by itself getting people out of jail for having weed on them, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So what I mean, it's like, now I think ideally what you want is a division of labor, right? Because to me, I think like the strategy of like the Mises Caucus, the 10th Amendment Center of like nullification, I think that pairs with agorism well, because you almost need a little bit of that counter economy there to create the demand to make the nullification popular enough that like it becomes politically viable. And because like the saying, politics is downstream of culture, so that's true to a point. But like agorism can create the demand that makes the political mechanism work, but you still need you need someone to actually go in there and hit the button to open the gates and let the people stop being jailed for cannabis possession. You know what I mean?
Like it's fantastic, except that it only gets you so far, and then you need something else to sort of push it right over the edge. for people who don't want to engage in politics, I'm just totally fine. I'm totally fine with that. I'm not fine with the fighting and bickering between agorists and, anarcho-capitalists like myself who are involved in politics. I think if you really want to go there, if you want to go that far and say you're completely removed from politics, then you also remove yourself from dialogue about politics and interacting with politicians. And so I consider that a contradiction. And, no one wants to be a hypocrite, right? So.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's I think there's this weird confusion, and like it's almost a confusion that both camps make. Like the Christian anarchists we were talking about before and the post libs have this weird view of power and political power that seems really, I don't know, like
Made up?
Yeah, like so
Not
I
real?
want to say not real, and it's this weird binary thinking where it's like they view political, like, listen, I understand, yeah, voting is violence, politics in the state is violence, but like there are varying degrees of force and violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like their argument, like to make an analogy, like the kind of like the straw man argument that people like. I was on a podcast last week and it was an anarchy versus manarchy discussion. And so the guy made an argument to me. He was like, yeah, well, in anarchy, what happens when a 5-year-old comes up and steals my apple and I shoot him in the face? And I was like, well, first of all, I'm a little concerned about your weird apple fetish. But second of all, those things just don't equate. Like, yeah, like he stole your apple, which is a violation of property rights, and he committed aggression. But those two acts of aggression, the stealing of an apple and the shooting the 5-year-old in the face, are not even in the same like planet. So, yeah, any political action has some measure of force or coercive power involved at some level, but it's not literally true that every single political action is you trying to lord over somebody else or you trying to claim power to like dominate or control. There are ways to use politics and to use legislation, to use the mechanisms in ways where the only force that's being used is kind of being applied back towards the state.
Yeah. Okay.
Is the way I look at it.
How about voting for a libertarian candidate who's not going to get elected?
Right.
Plenty of people didn't like Jo Jorgensen. I'm not going to say voting for her was violence. But
right. Yeah.
it resulted in no violent action. The worst violence you could say is that there were some tax dollars used to print the ballot and mail it out. That is it. That is as violent as it got. And, they're probably going to print those things out anyway.
True.
Voting for Joe Biden, I'd say that's kind of a violent thing. Voting down a property tax that is going to be foisted upon you against your will, I would say that is not violent. That is self-defense.
Yeah. Or like in California when they like vote against, because you guys have a lot of like the referendum voting. And yes. I think you guys have voted against raising your income tax. You've voted against
property tax is a big one. We have Prop 13 that keeps property taxes from being raised. Like you get grandfathered in. And every year people try to attack it and find little loopholes and had additional, and we thankfully, that's the one that we get voted down.
Yeah. But I was like, if you were an anarchist living in California, would you literally be like, nah, I'll just not show up and vote? Because if I vote against taxes being raised, that's violence. Or like, I don't know. That just seems like a really autistic argument, I guess.
It is. I encourage people, if you're a non-voting anarchist, I don't lay it on thick. Like I'm not a hard sell, but I'm like, just turn in a ballot that's totally blank except for those few things, voting against tax increases. Just do that and turn it in. I don't care if you don't vote for a human being, but for crying out loud, like we got to defend ourselves from being robbed by the state every year.
Well, yeah, and like not voting doesn't lead to less statism. This is a weird fallacy that gets created too. It's like they're like, oh well, if you vote, you're contributing to, you're legitimizing and perpetuating the system. I was like, I actually think the state likes the fact that there's not that many people voting because it's less people to manipulate.
Yeah, if we were the majority, then maybe that would make sense, but we're not. We're a very slim minority when it comes to voting. So
yeah, and it's like I don't think the state would go away. I mean, it depends on why. If suddenly we had this weird boost in libertarians, and let's say like, because already the majority doesn't vote. But if the majority of people, like we're talking 70, 80% of the population wasn't voting because they were hardcore libertarians like us, well, then that might end the state. But it's not the not voting that would end the state. It would be the collective movement of people going, I don't recognize the state, and they would probably just ignore it, and the state would have no power.
Right.
But a lot of people just don't vote because they don't care, or they don't get around to it, or whatever. They're just too busy living their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's so we could decrease the number of voters by half, and the state could triple in size. So to me, it's like
Absolutely.
it's these weird autistic arguments where it's just like, um, it's kind of like there's this funny joke I've heard before, where they're like 8 - 4 = 8, and it's like, how do you get that? Like, well, you have 8, you take away the 4, and you're just left with 8. Like, wait, no, that's not how math works. And it's like, it's that kind of logic that I feel like a lot of Christian anarchists and the post-libertarian types are using, where it's like, it sounds to some people like, oh, huh, that's clever. But it's like, wait, no, actually, think about it. It makes 0 sense.
Right.
It's
It's a
just a
clever
weird,
little
yeah.
thing you can say that has no bearing on reality, like in the way that you're saying it does. It's just a cute little phrase.
Yeah.
That's sort of the thing where, like the new phrase lately is people who live in Ancapistan in their heads, and it's not to disrespect people who are anarchists or say that anarchy will literally never happen or that your beliefs don't matter. It's just that a lot of people don't seem to. They pretend that we don't live in the real world, and we do live in the real world. And I'm very frustrated by the fact that I have to pay property taxes and that I might get pulled over by the cops for, driving with a tail light out or something up to
Yeah.
that effect. But it is reality. And so we have to operate within reality. Like, I don't want to unplug from reality because then I don't think that I'm affected, in really any respect.
Yeah. And I think that, more like the power thing. So like the post-libertarians often talk like the only way. It's like an analogy that Matt uses a lot is like you're playing the game the wrong way, or you're using a tool in a way it's not designed for it. If you're going to play politics at all, it should be to seize power and to. And I don't even know what he means after that. I'm like, do you
Right.
mean
And
like
then
seize
what?
power and then what? Like force liberty on people? Because I don't even know what that looks like
It's
exactly.
it's very
Um,
South Park underpants gnomes.
yeah.
And a lot of this is based on which is funny. It's very projection, because that's what he accused me of, even though I laid out step by step what it would look like if libertarians, for example, took local office, and lowered local taxes and nullified certain state and federal laws. That's what it would look like. What does it look like if you grab political power for the sake of power? So then you're in charge, right? And then you want to hold on to power, and you principles don't matter. So then you start making sacrifices. Okay. And that's how you become a normal politician. And you don't achieve political freedom or, whatever you want to think of it as for your constituents and maybe not even yourself. And what does it say? For me, like, political action needs to be based upon first principles. And if it's not, that's how you end up with populist movements that are reactionary. And that's what a lot of the post-libertarianism stuff sounds like to me. And those movements haven't been successful either. So I
No.
don't see how sacrificing your principles to try to do this quote unquote power grab, which has not been explained how that actually works, will actually end up getting you freer. Because, by the way, all those people who grab power, and I think at one point, he had explained that people who grab power just work behind the scenes. Like, no, that's not correct. They're all very involved in politics, usually at the local level, but they're very involved. They meet with city council members. They donate tons of money, behind the scenes, up front, whatever. They're extremely involved in politics. So you don't just get to grab power and instantly rise to the top. You have to engage.
Yeah, and it's like grab power where? Because the only power that is like a meaningful amount of power is at the federal government is in Washington. We're not getting a libertarian elected at the federal level anytime soon, if ever. Really, like I think really never. Like I think if a libertarian wins in Washington, as slimy as it is, they're not actually libertarian. Like they're worse. They're like Bill Weld or worse. You know what I mean? They're libertarian in
Yeah.
name, but what they've really become is just the GOP 2.0. There's no way that a principled libertarian like Dave Smith or Spike Cohen or even a Joe Jorgensen, there's no way that someone that principled gets that far and wins. Or even at Congress, I don't think it's really. I mean, not through the LP. I mean, Ron Paul did it through the GOP, but even then, I think it was like a special set of circumstances that's like once in a lifetime. And Rand has done it, and Massey, to an extent. But even then, like, do they have power? Not really. Like, what
They're
have
the
they done?
minority.
Yeah,
They're the minority. But and
but
some of this
yeah,
is a time preference thing, which is also something
sure,
that the power grab post-libertarian thing doesn't take into consideration. Or they'll say they do and then they just disregard everything we say about it, which is like you don't rise to the top and get elected to Congress through the Libertarian Party or really anything else in a couple of years. You have to plant the seeds, invest, work your way up, network with other people. And if the Libertarian Party wanted to become that sort of political force, which I hope to lead it to that, that's like at least 20 years in the making.
yeah,
We have to work towards that. You can't just jump in and say, "Oh, I have, a bunch of money, so I'm going to win." That didn't work for Bloomberg, the freaking mayor of New York, and he pumped tons of money into his campaign. So that's not going to work for us either. Or a
no,
post-libertarian.
yeah. And just to be clear to this comment, I don't think we were criticizing them as libertarians in a like I think Rand and Tom are good on a lot of issues. We're just saying
Yeah.
that they haven't been very effective in the political sense. I just wanted
Right.
to
Yeah.
clarify that.
I
I have
totally
some
agree.
disagreements with I think Rand compromised a bit too much in trying to work with Trump personally, but I still like Rand. I don't have anything huge against him. I will say, yeah, the federal government is where the main power is. And even then, if you you get like Rand and Thomas, they got elected. They can't do anything. And even if you got more of them in there and they tried to do something, I just think the way Washington politics work, that power is really more controlled by the corporate elites and the special interest, right? So I know Matt has said, well, that's where you have to go too. But I'm like, I don't know. I don't think trying to lobby to pedophiles and war criminals with my libertarian special interest group is really going to get me anywhere. Like, I don't see how that is a good strategy at all. But then, like, if you shift the conversation, because like the Mises Caucus and I think most sensible libertarians say you only run national candidates to like get a platform and to get the message across.
Yeah.
You really want to win elections at the state and even more so the local county level. That's where a majority of great, nullification and decentralization can be achieved. But then they're like, we'll do it through the GOP because it has more power. I'm like, well, I don't really think that's true because I don't think when you get down to the state and even more so the county level, the power that's at work at the federal level in Washington, D.C. really has as much of effect. I mean, they have some advantages in like ballot access, but other than that, especially at your local county level, it is not nearly as difficult to get elected under a libertarian banner as people think it is.
Correct.
And I actually think that you're better off doing it under the libertarian banner because if you do it through the GOP banner, the local GOP is going to be trying to control what you do. I mean, there might be isolated incidents. I know New Hampshire, like Jeremy Kauffman talks a lot about a lot of Liberty Republicans out there do a lot of good. So I don't know. There might be exceptions to this, maybe. And your mileage may vary, but I think for the most part, it makes more sense to do it through. I think it makes more because like, the GOP has so much baggage to it, right?
Yes.
So much baggage. Now, granted, the LP isn't exactly, perfect, but like the baggage it has is just kind of being a joke, which is like, any football, like the Cleveland Cavaliers were a joke, and then LeBron came and they won a championship, and then they weren't a joke anymore. And it's like, what I mean? Like a sports team can win a championship and go from mediocrity one year to greatness the next. And so just because you've been a failure in the past doesn't mean you can't succeed in the future. So that is not too hard to overcome. The GOP label, I think, is a lot harder to overcome because that baggage is kind of like slimy and gross and being a joke in a different way. Because I think Republicans have become a joke because they don't stand for anything. You know what I mean? Like they pretend to be for limited government, but then they just end up like, hey, instead of going in the left lane and driving 80 miles an hour, let's get back in the right lane and coast at 60. It's like, great victory, guys.
Yeah, conservatives haven't really conserved anything. Almost
No.
every single one of them voted to raise the national debt last year in an unprecedented amount, not a little bit,
Right.
And I got to tell you, at the county level, from LA County, I had a call with the GOP executive director a few hours ago about what are we going to do about vaccine passports that were just passed today, by the way, in Los Angeles County, the city of Los Angeles. They passed a law, an ordinance at the local level mandating everyone get vaccinations and show proof of it in order to engage in commerce indoors. Grocery stores will be an exception. They'll carve out a few. So I have been calling the GOP all week. What are you going to do? Are you guys going to help me out? Are we going to work on this in a single issue coalition? And she's just like, credit, at least I got a call back. Well, I don't know. What do we do? That's where we're at.
Well, I'll tell you a point. As a lot of these local county affiliates of the GOP or even the Democratic Party, they're not like well fine-tuned machines with lots of power. A lot of times, like in my county, I feel like our local LP county affiliate is way more organized and legitimate than our local GOP affiliate.
Yep.
And I feel like that's actually true in a lot of cases.
Yep.
So I think that the whole argument about like, well, do the GOP because it has more power just doesn't hold when you actually, put it up to scrutiny. It's just
people who are actually active in politics and attend city council meetings and see who passes what bill and who shows up, they'll tell you whether or not the GOP is active. And I'll tell you, in Los Angeles, and we got 11 million people in this county, 11 million people. The GOP is a joke. We are more politically active and have a better reputation than the GOP. And that's, it's not saying a lot.
No, but still, I mean, it does. And you've done a lot out there. So don't sell yourself too short. But but yeah, I think it makes sense that it's not that hard to win at the local level because the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they're way more focused on Washington and like, as local as they really care about, it's probably like governor races and maybe the state houses. So it's a little harder to win on the state level, although it's not impossible. It's just, it's still a bit of an uphill battle, but it's really not that hard to win at the local level if you get organized. And the Mises Caucus is really good at getting local county affiliates started and getting them active and, getting people running elections and getting them into those small positions, even if it's just city council or something like that. Like that starts to make a difference. Gets people's names out there, gets them, starting to have some political experience. And then, like it's really cool. Like I'm going for constable in my borough, and to get on the ballot, I have to go around and collect signatures. I wouldn't have to do that under the GOP banner. And so I'd be on the ballot and really like no one would know who I am. Because I had to do it to the libertarian banner and collect signatures, I got to talk with a lot of people in my borough. And like, of course they're asked like, oh, so why are you doing this? And it's like, well, because I'm running under minor party status in Pennsylvania, I have to get, X amount of signatures to get on the ballot. And so that opens the conversation and the door up to be like, oh, hey, this guy's a libertarian. And so you have a lot of conversations with people who are like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know we had a local LP. And then you get them to come out. And like our local county affiliate is growing at an exponential rate right now. I mean, we had like 3 or 4 people like a year and a half ago. And like we had a meeting last month that was like 40 people, and then even more online. That, I mean, it was like we were actually not prepared for it. It was chaotic. So many people showed up to our first in-person meeting. So it's, I think a lot of people, especially right now with all the lockdowns and stuff, like they see the Republican Party as a joke and that the Democratic Party doesn't care about personal liberties anymore. So there's a lot of people that are really seriously ready to check the LP out and give them an honest shake if you're willing to just show up and be like, hey, we're here and we're going to get something done and have an actual plan to do something.
Yep. Well, we're putting in the work, and that's what we got to do. It's the Libertarian Party has operated with a high time preference for I don't know, since its existence, at least for the last 20 years. And so that's something that we've been changing. The Mises Caucus, at least, is we're actually putting in the work at the local level. And I got to tell you, as someone who lives in California, like, that's where you're able to stand down tyranny. There are
Yeah.
counties that said, we're not going to abide by the governor's orders. We're not going to ticket people. We're not going to harass businesses. It's the county and the cities that are standing up against people like Gavin Newsom. So that's really where you can make a huge difference.
Yeah, and you're not passing laws that are adding any kind of more power to the state or any violence.
No.
It's political action that's entirely defensive, and
Yeah.
actually, it's like you're cutting off the enforcement arm of the state to enforce their tyrannical laws. And when you do that, it's entirely in keeping with libertarian and anarchist philosophy. I think I think part of Matt's problem and a lot of these people is they just don't understand the strategy that the LP, like specifically what the Mises Caucus wants to do in the LP. Like I feel like it's a complete like they're just, oh, you guys are trying to do the same game as the GOP and the the Democrat Party and do it through the LP, and you're just going to fail. It's like, well, yeah, if we were trying to play their game on their terms, yeah,
Right.
we'll get her at it. That's the history of the LP. Is the LP trying to play the statist game on the statist terms and getting their ass kicked over and over again. And so the Mises Caucus is like, hey, how about what if we play a different game? And it's not about, it is kind of about the decentralization at the local level, but it's also about growing the movement, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is like the reason we look to Ron Paul is to be like, what if we could do what Ron Paul did, but do it from a party, and instead of it being centered around one person, it's centered around the actual philosophy.
Yes.
And to me, like if you get that going, it doesn't have to, the Ron Paul Revolution 2.0 doesn't have to end like the first revolution did. I think it
Right.
can continue. And the point to waking people up, because in that debate, which people definitely watch it when Lions of Liberty releases it, Matt keep pressing you like wake them up for what? It's like, do you not understand the relationship between like if you have a culture of people who want liberty, that will in effect naturally create a society and a governing structure that is more liberty minded. You can't like he's right and he's wrong on so many things, because he'll talk about how most people don't want liberty, and it's like, yeah, that's the problem. That's what needs to be solved.
Correct.
If you say that problem can't be solved, then you've just basically admitted defeat. But I
Right.
don't think
And a power grab by an even smaller minority of the minority doesn't solve that.
right. Yeah, exactly. So it's like what we have to do is get more people to care about liberty and to realize what the state is and what it represents.
It's very
And
interesting, like the relationship between this and Christianity. You're supposed to be the
mm,
salt and light of the earth. And so
right,
they'll say, well, yes, that's correct in Christianity. And then I'm like, well, do you do it? And they're like, well, no, but I'm doing this family thing. I'm like, ah, but you don't do it. And then does that analogy carry over into politics? And the answer is usually not yes or no. The answer is to change the subject and talk about power or something else. Like,
right,
what is it? Do we witness to people or not? And
right.
it's a very direct black and white question. Do we witness to people or not? And if you think or not, then okay, I'll let you have it. But don't tell me it's biblical based. Uh, does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. And you did a really good job in the debate of bringing that up and using that biblical imagery of like we're supposed to be a light to the world. We're supposed to be evangelizing people, not by seizing power and like because Jesus was rejected as Messiah because the Jews had an expectation that he was
Right.
going to be a Messiah who seized power and took on the Romans. But Jesus kept on telling them, no, like, my kingdom is not of this world, and we don't battle against flesh and blood, but against the forces of darkness and against
Yep.
principalities. And what the correlations here are so perfect because as Christians, what we preach to people is not what Christians should be doing is preaching to people, not like condemning them for their sin and be like, you need to change this and that, and your life is so messed up. But no, we need to be showing them, hey, like you're lost in darkness, and this is a light that you can run towards that will save you. And not only run towards, but this, if you just say like, I'm ready for this, that Jesus will run towards you. And to me, that's what we as libertarians should be doing. We should be reaching out to people in our communities, in our country, in our society who are suffering under the darkness of statism, and be offering them a light to be like, listen, you're
Yes.
struggling. You're like, you see all this crap around you. Like, we have the answers. We have the proper worldview that explains what is going on. And you can join us. We can join together, and we can overcome this. You know what I mean? Like, to me, like, we should be inspiring people to fight against, principality, like the Bible talks about. We shouldn't be telling people, go retreat from the world and go, find your little kingdom to rule over and let the world fall apart into darkness. Unless you're and like I'm probably coming across really like critical and judgmental of Matt, but like sometimes he comes across like this, a little bit like a false prophet of sorts, where he's just like, oh well, the end's coming and I know exactly, we don't have much time, and it's kind of like this alarmist talk too. And I'm just like, I don't know, like the state probably will collapse at some point, but even then, like the states usually collapse and just build back up in a different way. And I don't know, like the state is really good at, like, especially like some states go bankrupt and it's a big deal for them. But when America has this giant empire that it has, and this, like, the hands around the throat of so many countries with how many military bases we have, I don't know if there is actually a scenario where, there's any kind of economic collapse of major significance in terms of the political power that America holds. You know what I mean? Like, I just feel like, it's possible. I don't know. Like, I don't know, but I'm not willing to say, oh, the collapse is inevitable. And even if it is, it could be 30 years in the future. It could be 100 years in the future. I don't know.
Okay, let's unpack some of this. So the three things that come to mind are lobbying, ushering in the kingdom of God, and the remnant. So I don't have a problem when it comes to power, political power, however you want to interpret that. I don't have a problem with lobbying. That's how politics work. It's Machiavellianism, for example. That term is way abused and misused. Lobbying is okay as long as you're not compromising your morals. Pressuring people to vote a certain way, donating to campaigns, making your voice known, withholding resources, pitting enemies against each other. These are things that happen in politics. Lying and cheating and stealing, those are the things you want to avoid. So if you could separate that, then you can sort of move forward in the political framework without being a scumbag or an immoral person. And then as far as retreating and worrying about collapse, what do you want to do? Like in Isaiah, what was God telling Isaiah? He was saying, you're going to go out and you're going to preach and you're going to do it. And people are going to reject you and they're going to mock you. And Isaiah's like, well, what's the point? And God's like, because there's a bunch of other people out there who are kind of scattered and barely hanging on. And those are the ones who are really going to be ready to receive your message. And they know that everybody else is morally bankrupt, and when everything burns down and is destroyed, it's the rest of you who are going to rebuild. Right. So when, like that's ushering in the kingdom of God, whatever you want to call it. And that's also putting up that framework that post-libertarians seem to be so worried about when it comes to a power vacuum. Like, I know I don't want to live in a place that's overtaken by morally bankrupt psychopaths either. And that's why we should build our own infrastructure. Right? Like that is our job, is we are building we're making our own parachute.
Yeah. And I think the LP is a better vehicle for that than the GOP, because
absolutely
a lot of people in the GOP don't really have the same goals as us. Whereas the LP, beyond just the political utility of it, it's a great place to network and meet more people. And like, you're in the same, Discord, Signal chats and all that, like a lot of our people are constantly talking about this stuff, and in their local counties and states, and even nationally, they're talking about agorism. They're talking about ways to build infrastructure and to prepare for different things. Like, we're creating not just a political movement, but it is a revolution, and it's taking a life and a culture of its own, of
Yes.
people that, like, will be able to be that remnant and rebuild if a collapse does happen. Whereas if everyone's just isolated from each other, that's a lot harder to do. I feel like Matt thinks that we're supposed to be Noah, but really, like, we're not supposed to be Noah. We're not supposed to
No.
just be building. And even Noah saved some people, right? Or saved,
Mm-hmm.
animals and stuff. But we're not supposed to be Noah. I don't think that that's the role of Christians anymore. I think we are supposed to be like Isaiah. We're supposed to be like the apostles, and even if you don't believe in God and stuff, if you're secular or agnostic listening to this, just look at it metaphorically. Just look at the archetypes that are being spoken about here, and I think you can still hear what we're talking about, and
Yeah.
realize the wisdom and the significance of it, which is like, a movement that's built on like, if you're building a movement to set people free, but it's built on things that aren't it isn't a culture of freedom, it's just not going to work. If you're trying to get to liberty by building a culture of protectionism and isolationism, that's just a house of cards. You have to build a culture of liberty on top of principles that are actually compatible with liberty,
Yep.
if that
God
makes
has
sense.
not commanded us to build another ark.
No.
And I get the sentiment. I see it on Facebook sometimes or Twitter. Build an ark, build the ark.
Right.
That is not God's command.
Nope.
So I don't want to tell people don't hedge your bets, but don't put all of your eggs in that basket.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Um, so, for those who are listening, maybe there's some people who are, curious about getting involved in the LP, or they're in the LP, but they just haven't heard. I wanted to give you a chance here to talk at the end just about your run for chair in the LNC, and just talk about, the things that, not just in the Mises Caucus, but just in general, if you are elected as chair at the next convention, what you want to do in the LP, and where you see the LP going over the next, maybe 5 to 10 years, if you're, able to get in and affect the change, and bring the policies into effect that you want to bring.
Yeah, I think there are two things that would probably really speak to your audience. And one is that I want to make the Libertarian Party more libertarian and a welcoming place to people who are solid libertarians, fans of Ron Paul, so on and so forth. And another group of people that the LP has not been very welcoming to is Christians. We are generally, as a group, very welcoming to atheists, pagans, libertines, and say we scream tolerance in people's faces, but we're not very welcoming to Christians. And I think that's wrong. And I would like to see the Libertarian Party culture say, hey, we appreciate Christian libertarians. And as long as you're not trying to, exercise moral judgment over everyone else in an aggressive way, like, we want you in the party. So that's something I'm really committed to doing. I think that is really important. And I think that we definitely need to make the Libertarian Party a more welcoming place to Christian libertarians. And we got to improve that messaging, right? So that's something I'm really committed to. We don't need any more watered down social justice messaging. You can be compassionate and care about people without talking about voluntary lockdowns and how you should have private mask mandates.
Are you actively anti-muddied down message, Angela?
I'm actively anti-muddied down messaging, which you will know if you have listened to me on public comment on city council. And that's something else I'd like to push, is trying to explain to people how to actually be effective when they're doing local politics. I've been on public comment for LA City Council 3 times in the last week, dropping the Libertarian Party of Los Angeles County's website and my phone number, and telling people to contact me if they oppose what's going on locally. I have had more phone calls and emails than I can count. You got to lead by example. Don't vote in anyone who is not willing to lead by example and who's not willing to do the groundwork and train other leaders. And that's something that is like very important to me. It's not dictate and just tell everybody to do things, and it's not do everything yourself. Like, it's lead by example and build a community. That's what I want to do. It's not, we're not building an arc, we're building a community.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Um, what would you say, there's different views on what the role of the chair is um, in libertarian circles. Like there's some people that seem to push like a strong chair model, that the chair is kind of like, I don't know, like the voice. And then there's some people
Mm-hmm.
that say like, they'll be like, oh, well, I'm just the chair. I'm just the facilitator. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that the role of the chair is to be more of kind of like a, not a dictator, but sort of like a person that sets the pace and a direction, so to
Yeah.
speak? And is that what you would seek to do?
So the chair is a leader. You're a leader, you're an administrator, and in my opinion, you are also the mouthpiece of the party, because we don't have um, the same number of candidates and elected officials that other parties do. So the chair plays a more important role. But that does not mean that the chair should be making all the decisions. The chair should not decide a bunch of things unilaterally. The chair should keep all of the officers and executive committee members in the loop and do group decision making. And the chair also sets the tone for the national party's culture. I think that's really important. And so, we've seen in the past that that former chairs have been like openly hostile to other libertarians, and then the most recent chair, who resigned, did not keep his officers in the loop, and there was just like a lot of fighting and secrecy, and that's not healthy for the culture. So, will I be making dictatorial decisions behind closed doors and not telling anyone? No. But I will be doing interviews and speaking out a lot about libertarianism, and I'll be encouraging other people to do the same and trying to change the culture in the LP.
One of the things you've talked about, I think, is that there's not enough resources, I guess, for candidates.
That's
Um,
correct.
what
Yeah.
what would you do? Is that something where you think we need more donors, or is it more like there's things that need to be changed in the delivery mechanism? Like, what are your ideas there to help support candidates more as far as like getting the resources that they need to be successful?
So that's complex. One of the problems is that the messaging is so bad, we don't get as many new members as we should. And that means we also
Hmm.
don't get as many new donors. So you fix the messaging, and that's going to make a lot of other things much easier. And then there are state parties who don't have a lot of faith in the national party. And for those of you who are listening and you're not very involved in libertarian politics, you have a national party, you have 50 state parties, and you have county parties in almost every state party. So it all sort of is related, but it's separate. And the state and the county parties don't always have a lot of faith in national, because they don't like the messaging, because they don't like what happened with the New Hampshire debacle and the CRM. So healing that is going to make it so that the resources that we have at the national level for candidates will be used and more readily available, because right now state parties don't even care. Like, they don't want the resources, and that's not a healthy relationship. We all need to be able to work together and lean on each other.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we're talking a little bit about of inner party politics stuff, and half my audience might be a little bit
Yeah.
oblivious to it, but for those who are aware of it, I mean, what are your thoughts on like the fractioning that is going on in the party? Different factions warring over each other. I mean, libertarian Twitter is like World War III sometimes. You just I log onto Twitter and like my notifications will be at like 50, and I'm just like, oh god, like what's you know like brace for impact. What's going on today? I can't tell you how many times I think I've been called a Nazi at least 10 times in the past week, if I was
Mm,
to keep count.
yeah.
And then on the flip side, there's even people in my own camp sometimes who I think, like as a Christian, I probably have a little bit different view than other people in the Mises Caucus and the LP do, because like when people are nasty to me, I do try to, for the most part, turn the other cheek. And sometimes like when other people don't do that, I'll get a little frustrated because I'm just like, hey, let's just ignore these people if they're being shitty to us. But not everyone's going to do what I want them to
Right.
do. Which as a libertarian, like I have to accept that, of course. Um, But, I mean, what do you think you could do, once elected chair to help foster maybe, I mean, there's bad actors that I think just have to be not even removed. I think they'll just leave.
They're
I don't think any force.
self-selecting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
they're
for the other
leaving.
people that, maybe they're not going to leave, but maybe they feel scorned and they're just, people are a little skeptical of a new regime taking over. What do you think we can do? All of us, like I'm talking both like what can you do, like what are your plans to do, but also what can we as individuals who are in the Mises Caucus and the LP, what can we do to help make this party less about, focus less on the infighting and more on, hey, like we don't have to agree on everything, but on the stuff we do agree on, let's agree to work well together on that, and then just freely disassociate on the things that maybe we have different views on.
Well, you put in the work. If you're focused on putting in the work, then you're not focused on sniping at each other on social media. By the way, I think libertarian Twitter is about 100 times better than libertarian Facebook. Libertarian
Really?
Facebook is like the delegate groups and things like that. It is incredibly toxic and just a social club and really nasty. And I don't think it's actually a reflection of the libertarian community. It's only a reflection of the party, which is just the priorities are completely wrong. The Libertarian Party is very confused about where it fits in the liberty movement. They think that they're the foundation, and they're not. They're just a little piece.
No.
The foundation is libertarians, and there's a lot more of them outside of the party right now, sadly, than inside of the party. So I think we need to focus on doing the work and not concern ourselves with infighting. And it's still going to happen to a certain degree, and that's okay. We don't have control over everything, and we never will. It's just human nature. And there are going to be people who self-select out. They're going to scream and they're going to cry and they're going to throw a temper tantrum and they're going to leave the party, and that is okay. And I wish them the best in life. And I will be way too busy doing important things to antagonize them on social media. And when they
We'll
do,
work with them once they join the Green Party.
yeah, that's fine. Go and do your thing and
Yeah.
enjoy your voluntary mask mandates and staying at home and locking down. Like,
Right.
best of luck in your life. You can pray for these people. You can love them like God from a distance.
Right.
Just
it's social
not up
distance
close.
loving.
Yeah. Like, I don't know, how far away God is. We say he's in the room, but
yeah.
I have to think of it in a little bit of a more pedestrian, juvenile, million miles away kind of outlook when it comes to people who are openly calling for me to die or saying they hate me and that I'm a Nazi.
God.
Okay, well, have a nice life outside of the party.
It's really hard. Like, I struggle. Like, I've had people tell me, you're subhuman and turn your kids into the state because anything raised by you will not be human. It's like, God, what's the, like, I was just like, I definitely failed to come up with Christ-like responses to those
totally
people.
And I am definitely not the best example of how Christians should live, and that's on me. None of us are perfect.
None of us are perfect.
None of us are perfect,
fall short.
But we're going to do the best that we can, right, as human beings. And I don't usually put myself out there on a lot of Christian podcasts because my personal life is, not in, it's not the greatest example. But the reality is this is the world we're living in. And unfortunately, I am one of the better examples of libertarianism right now from a Christian perspective. So I would challenge other people, like, you could probably do a lot better than me, right? So if you're thinking out there like, oh, I could do better, please do. Please be that public person.
Well, even like with the Mises Caucus, when people complain we're ruining the party and we're not going to get anything done, it's like, okay, well, go show us how it's done. Like, if you outcompete us and you win, you get liberty achieved, I'm not going to complain.
Competition is healthy. Competition is healthy, and it's natural. I hate to break it to all of the people that hate capitalism. Competition and hierarchies are natural. We see them in nature. We see them in parks and human relationships. And so we're competing right now. We are competing for the party. We are having a battleground fight, or we're fighting in the battleground of ideas. Like, that's just, that's where we're at. I would love it much more if people kept it, a little more civil between people that we're supposed to be working with. But We'll see what
Yeah, and
happens.
and I just tell people like you have to learn to just realize that there's going to be people that you guys don't have exactly the same goals, same personalities. Some people they like to edgelord and shitpost on Twitter. If that offends you, just ignore it. You know what I
Yes.
mean? Like that's infinitely better than spending all your time complaining about it.
Aren't
And
there?
like
There are
I
so many
yeah,
worse things to be outraged over.
yeah,
People are outraged over jokes that I make on social media, but they're not outraged about mandatory vaccination.
yeah. No,
What? Where? Or
it's silly.
lockdowns and small businesses destroyed and people committing suicide and churches being closed for a year? Those are the
Yeah.
things to be outraged over,
Yep.
not jokes.
Yeah, pastors have been arrested and Christians arrested in their churches for just like
Showing up.
wanting just showing up. I mean, parents arrested for taking their kids to the parks, people arrested for driving. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting. And even just the generic stuff like the war on drugs and the wars. I mean, I say generic because they're just brought up a lot, but they're not generic. They're still, horrible human rights violations that are happening on a daily basis. So it's like,
Right.
I mean, we just gotta have a little bit of perspective here.
Yeah,
Um,
and for people listening who don't understand, really, that might not have made much sense. But so there's a social justice faction within the Libertarian Party that cares a lot about virtue signaling to the left, and they care about it much more than libertarian principles, and certainly much more than Christian principles, because they're not doing it from a Christian perspective either. That's a whole
yeah.
nother episode, though. I would love to do a deep dive on the problems with progressivism and how it's encroached upon Christianity.
Oh yeah. That's definitely a subject that could be a whole different podcast.
Yeah.
The last point I wanted to make, this is something I've been saying lately. I was on my friend James's podcast, Blackbird, and we made this point, and I wanted to run it by you, get your thoughts on it. I feel like another parallel here, like because there's things in Christianity I criticize a lot too as a Christian anarchist, and I feel like there's a problem of institutionalism, and I feel like
Hmm.
it's affecting both the Libertarian Party and the Christian, like the Christian church, like the community. And the problem is there's too many people that have built these institutions as if the people should serve the institutions, when really the
Yes.
institutions should exist to serve the people. The church should exist to, like what Christ taught was that to be a leader is to be a servant. Jesus washed his apostles' feet as a demonstration of this.
Yes.
And I feel like there's too many libertarians who feel like we exist to serve the party and it's about advancing the
Yes.
party. About it's just like blindly win elections and just it's all about like what's good for the party. And I'm like, no, the party is a tool that should serve the movement, that should serve liberty. And to
The
me, that
party,
just makes intuitive sense. But I don't, for some reason, a lot of people just don't seem to make that connection.
it's, ironically, that's much more Machiavellian. The party should be based on first principles and it should be purpose driven. And so should the church. There are some interesting parallels here, and it's something that I was really turned off by when I moved to LA as a teenager. I found that every church that my family visited was like, this is how God can fix your life in 5 easy steps. And I was like, oh. And then we would visit another one, and it was like
Yeah.
object lessons for 8-year-olds. And it was every church I attended. And they're all over in exactly 45 minutes or 1 hour. And they have the
Yeah.
same like cookie cutter Joel Osteen vibe of a worship service. And I don't hate drums. Like I like heavy metal, but it starts to all sound like eerily similar. It's the purpose driven or I'm sorry,
Yeah. Yeah. The
I
purpose.
think it's called purpose driven church, but it's not purpose
Yeah.
driven.
No.
It's commercial, and I love capitalism, but that's not the point of the church. But the
No.
Libertarian Party behaves the same way. They are
Yeah.
not purpose driven anymore. They will say that they are the party of principle, but they are the party of perpetually failing at elections because for some reason that's what we're supposed to do. I don't understand it.
Right. And if you would all criticize that, you're spitting in the faces and demonizing and brutally attacking people if you would all criticize that, hey, Libertarian Party hasn't actually done anything over the past,
Oh gosh.
40 years. These
And
people
they
are,
haven't,
yeah,
and
yeah,
it's been because it's been irresponsibly managed. It's a wonderful tool, and I would like to use that tool in a much better way. And I would also like to do that in a principled way, because what the heck is the point of this? what the heck is the point? Just go join the GOP or the Democratic Party or whatever if all you want is just political success by any means necessary. And I wish you the best of luck. I don't even say it like in an angry way. It's just, this isn't for you. It's for someone else.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's too many people that like their version of libertarianism is that like really cringy, like it's like we're socially conservative and fiscally socially liberal and fiscally conservative, or it's like to me it's just there's too many people that's like you're not a libertarian, you're either a Democrat that likes guns or a Republican who smokes weed.
Right. And we're not all that doesn't even describe us all. Not everyone is socially liberal. Sorry.
No. I lean more socially conservative. Now, I don't want the government to be involved in pushing any of my social views on anyone else, but like, someone earlier on Twitter today was like, we need to normalize polyamorous relationships. And I was like, no, I don't. I was like, you're free to do it. I don't care if you do it, but I'm not going to go out there and promote it and normalize it because I actually don't think it's a good idea.
It's not my prerogative. Like, if other people want to do that, they can do it. It's fine. Personally, I don't think it's a good idea. It's not the hill I'm going to die on, though. It's just like, okay, whatever. Like there's a lot of things I'm not into, and that's one of them.
Yeah, and it's like you're not less libertarian if you have different social views than other libertarians. Like, I wouldn't call someone not libertarian because they, they're libertarian and they live a socially progressive, like secular atheist lifestyle. It's like, okay, you're still a libertarian.
Yep.
And I'm also still a libertarian if like I'm a Christian who wants to promote more traditional like views on marriage and sex. It's like, I don't know, like, I'm not anti-LGBT, but I also don't think that, I think some parts of that movement are overly celebratory or in this kind of weird cult celebration of certain aspects of that like, it's not my thing. Now, if it's your thing, go ahead. If you're not hurting anybody, I don't care. But calling me a bigot or a fascist because I don't have the same exact worldview as you, just, this isn't what libertarianism should be about. And this isn't what we should be focused on.
It's we should not be spending so much energy glorifying sexual preferences. And a good indicator of the fact that it's tilted, it's slanted in one direction more than the other is, can we get an article on lp.org celebrating some aspect of conservative Christian lifestyle? You know what the answer to that is? Like, I'm almost laughing even like formulating the sentence. And I'm not super conservative. I kind of LARP as a social conservative. I'm more of a social moderate, like that's just, whatever. That's the world that I've made for myself, whether I like it or not. Here I am. Right. Even that would trigger some people at the National Party. Oh, you said you're a social moderate. Yeah, sorry. Like, I'm in my 30s and I'm divorced with 2 cats. This is my world,
It's the problem with left-leaning thinking, and there's problems with right-leaning thinking too, don't get me wrong, but the problem with left-leaning progressive mindsets is that they just keep getting more and more progressive. And so like someone who's progressive now will be deemed a conservative in 10 years. Totally. So it's like they end up getting more and more like this small hyper minority, but they get louder somehow. So it's just, I don't know. It's just silly. Well, we're coming up to the close here. But yeah, I think we touched everything we wanted to touch on. Give your, Twitter handles and plugs and stuff that you want to give for those who want to come check you out more and see what you're doing.
Yeah, I would love to hear from people. If they're interested in the Libertarian Party, you can contact me at angelamcardle.com. I should have an updated schedule of places that I'm going to be visiting posted within the next couple of days. You can find out about all the crazy vaccine passport stuff. Support me on Patreon if you so choose. I spent a lot of money on a special performance art project today, which will be interesting. And you can find me on Twitter at Angela4LNC Chair, but I'm on all the social media, so you can find me on any of it.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks, Angela, for coming on. I think it was a fantastic conversation. And, I hope it encourages some Christians who are libertarians, but on the fence about the LP to at least consider looking at it. If it's not your thing, hey, no worries, no problems. I'm not going to hold it against you if party politics is not your cup of tea. It's not everybody's cup of tea. But at the very least, maybe throw us a vote if you're happen to be free on election day. Or if it does interest you, definitely, check out Angela stuff, check out the Mises Caucus. I think you'll find a lot of like-minded people who want to use the political sphere not to rule and lord over people, but to actually, set people free and resist the state to at least, be a voice, that says no, right? And I think that's important. I think that our role right now is to at least be collectivizing in some manner and vocally saying no to all this crap that the state keeps pushing on us. So, yeah, that's all I got. Subscribe, give a like if you can to the podcast. I'd appreciate it. Other than that, thanks again, Angela, for coming on. And thanks for those of you for watching. And everyone have a good rest of your night.
Thanks for having me.
Yep, thank you.